Well, I'm Professor Beverly Kienzle, and I first want to introduce Paul Barron of the Radcliffe Institute, who's the person who invited me to organize something, and that's how we all got here today. And he invited me in the summer, which was the perfect time to say, oh, that's a long way off.
That's right, yeah, we tricked you.
But, so I was happy to do it and happy to think that I had a long time to get ready.
Thank you very much. I just want to say thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Beverly and the organizers, and Kristen Gus especially for putting together such a wonderful program. The Radcliffe Institute is putting on a conference in April called Confronting Violence, which is looking at gender-based violence in a variety of capacities in a variety of ways around the world. And in and around that, we've been doing programming since September, and that's why we were in conversation for almost 10 months now, about trying to showcase some researchers, teachers, academicians, and fellows from around the campus who are also doing similar work. And this is where this event comes out of. We're delighted, and you really have provided a unique perspective on the overall topic that we would never have had the chance to have before. So thank you very much for your generosity. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you. I think I'll continue the thanks for a minute here before we three speakers introduce ourselves. I want to thank Paul and Amy, who works with him from the Radcliffe Institute, and Kristen, again, will get thanked for all the hard work that went into this. Alice and Carrions also helped out, and so did Darlene Slagle. And Bob DeVoe and the IT office. So we have all of these things thanks to them. And Michael Naughton, who wrote a piece for the Harvard Divinity School webpage about this event, which we appreciated. I also want to acknowledge a couple of previous grants that Nancy and I had from the Divinity School. We go back a long way, 1993. And in 1994, we had a course development grant from the Lilly Foundation, which really got us going. And then in 2008 to 2009, we received a grant from the Center for the Study of World Religions for research, and we had some students working with us, helping us to gather materials with a special focus on religious traditions other than Christianity. Today we'll focus on Christianity. We'll have a hard time getting in everything we want to say as it is, but you will hear us mention especially Nancy's work with interfaith organizations. I also want to acknowledge a former student and dear friend who makes donations to my research fund in honor of my father, and he has helped with a lot of our research endeavors. And then, of course, I want to thank Nancy and Robert for participating with me. And I think that rather than my trying to describe what they do, I'll ask them to introduce themselves for just a minute, because they're both so busy I can't really keep up with them. So, and I would certainly leave out things, so I'll ask them to sort of prioritize and tell us what they do that's related to intimate partner violence and why they are such a wonderful addition to our panel. Nancy?
Good afternoon. I'm Nancy Nienhuis, and I'm the Dean of Campus Life and Professor of Theology and Social Justice over at Andover Newton Theological School, but it's nice to be back in my old stomping grounds here. And among, besides the writing and research that Beverly and I have done over the years, I teach a class every year called When Home is a War Zone, to teach people who are going into ministry how to be resources, not roadblocks, when they encounter domestic violence, intimate partner violence. So I participate in an organization called Safe Havens, an interfaith partnership against domestic violence too, and have done some work on the national level, especially around the Violence Against Women Act, to make sure that funding would be included for people who are going to be future faith leaders. So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight.
Thank you, Nancy. Robert?
Hello, and thank you to Beverly and Nancy for involving me with this. About me, well, my academic interests really lie in the construction and performance of masculinities in film. Sadly, a large part of that is the way in which violence is shown on screen. In a moment when I introduce the film, I'll talk a little bit, very briefly, about how violence is often trivialized in the construction of male characters. But before I came to academia, I worked in various things. I worked part-time in a prison where I taught prisoners, male prisoners, many of whom were incarcerated for acts of violence against numerous people, including, of course, sadly, their wives, partners, and indeed even children. At that time, I also worked in making films for exhibition in festivals, and the film we'll see is one that was submitted to a festival. Sadly, it wasn't accepted, but it has been used since to raise awareness of violence against women and to ask pertinent questions. The film also has received a lot of feedback from people who are trapped in violent relationships. I don't know if it's actually helped anyone leave, but certainly it's acted as a catalyst for discussion. So that's me.
Thank you, Robert. And my major areas, I'm a medievalist, and my major interests are in sermons and preaching and women's history of all sorts, and hagiography. One year I was looking for female saints to include. This is a long time ago, before there were any of them translated, or very few translated. And I started coming upon one saint after another who was a victim of abuse, generally from the husband, and the husband went off, just disappeared from the story, or maybe converted, or somehow just escaped any kind of blame. So my first reaction was, this is horrible. And then I thought, well, how do I get from this is horrible to there is a theology underlying this to which we need to oppose a different theology. And the way I got there was with Nancy's help, because she's a feminist theologian. And we talked about these things, and little by little I translated them, and that's how my work has built up. I was, for a time, participating on the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, what was it called? Women Empowered, and I brought Nancy to be on it too when we did programs at churches around the diocese and deaneries, which are conglomerations of parishes, and we did quite a bit together and provided materials and served as guest preachers. And I have had to slow down what I've been doing, but Nancy is still going full speed ahead. And we're glad to have this connection, and we're very grateful to be spurred onward. We have published 2 lengthy papers from conference papers that we gave. And we taught together in the Harvard Extension for a couple of years, and that was really a great experience for us. And we made a promise to each other the last time we did that we would write out our lectures so that we'd have the basis for a book. And we did that. We're still working on revising them. That this summer may be the one. So be looking for us. We hope to be in print before long. And yeah, that's enough. So I think now, yes, we move to the film that Robert's going to show us, and he'll introduce it a bit. I'll go to my chair.
So in a few moments, we're going to watch a film on relationship violence that I co-wrote and directed. So the initial idea for the film came from a conversation on how public health authorities in England, where I'm from, raise awareness of relationship violence. I was, and remain impressed by how images can be used to reflect the controlling manipulation and the fear that accompany acts of violence against partners. As a filmmaker, however, I was and remain acutely aware of how popular films are inclined to trivialize violence against women. Usually this is done to help the audience understand a complex man. At other times, men are shown to suffer violence themselves. Nonetheless, films very rarely show violence from the perspective or point of view of both the abuser and the abused. Instead, violence is used to code a complex man as being weak, strong, or the variant of the two. There are, of course, exceptions to this. Martin Scorsese directed Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which was released in 1974. It's a film that stars Ellen Burstyn as Alice, a young woman, or a woman rather, moving on from and through abuse at the hands of men. Likewise, Ridley Scott directed Thelma and Louise, which was released in 1991, which again tells the story of women, in this case, two women escaping from abusive men. In making my film The Object of Affection, as a male filmmaker, I wanted to focus on a woman trying to leave an abusive relationship. Too often, women are portrayed either as victims through their economic class or as compromised middle-class wives and partners who are trapped by what appears to be comfortable lifestyles. The Object of Affection tells a story of a woman preparing to leave her home, and it ends with British statistics, which are harrowing and tragically reflective of the situation for women in many other parts of the world. I'll stop here so that you can watch the film and we can discuss your initial responses after we've seen it.
Hi. Yes, everything's fine. Thanks for calling. I haven't been able to think of anything else all day. You know I couldn't have come this far without your help. Yes, everything's packed, and I'm all set for tomorrow. Yes, don't worry. Everything is going according to plan. Everything is going according to plan. Yes, it's in the last place he'd ever look. No, not a chance. Definitely. And anyway, for some things, he really is that stupid. he really is that stupid. He really is that stupid. Yes, my mind is made up. This time I'm going. This time I will. I've told you why not. It can't be tonight. It can't be tonight. Don't worry, I'll be fine. It's just one more night. I'll be fine. It's just one more night. Just one more night.
I see that you're leaving behind on the floor. Black and white photograph we took down at the shore. We lay there till morning, and you and I agreed that we could face forever like the shoreline and the sea. How can I get you to open your heart? I've broken my silence and I've broken in half. Now I'm drowning. Forgive me. Why did I let you down? Forgive me. I should have stayed around. Leaving you on your own. Forgive me. I never should have gone. Why did I let you down? I've never felt so alone. Leaving you on your own. Why did I let you down?
Yes, don't worry. Everything is going according to plan. And anyway, for some things, he really is that stupid. Don't worry, I'll be fine. It's just one more night.
before we go to Nancy's presentation, there's just time for any initial responses or questions you'd like to raise about the film that you've watched. I should point out that the lead actor is in the audience and co-writer as well.
Are the statistics current? I mean, are they the same now as when you made the film?
Statistics were sent to me this morning from Ed, who found them in the newspaper from the UN, and they're shockingly pretty similar to that. Those figures were from Britain, but they show that it's, yeah, the figures are really tragically scary for many parts of the Western world. Imagine what it's like elsewhere. Yeah. It's quite a shocking film, isn't it, really? And is sad. One of the difficulties I found making the film was learning how to code what it's like to be controlled. I work closely with someone who works a lot with the victims of violence, and her advice was to show the small things and small ways in which someone's manipulated. So you notice at the beginning, Alison is very careful and meticulous in how she lays out the envelopes. Everything in the house is very, very ordered. And then later, when she awakes from her end-of-the-day glass of wine, induced snooze, she's very concerned that the music's on that her husband or partner won't like. She's concerned that the kids' toys are still out. She's concerned that she spilt wine over one of his shirts. So it's all kind of about fear, all the small ways in which her life is completely manipulated. And I found that quite difficult to get into that mindset. And in fact, the guy who is the monster in the film was done by two of us. I appear as a hand at the door and smashing the flowers. The feet are the feet of the cameraman. We both argued about who was going to do it. So we, rather than drawing straws to see who would get the shortest, we decided to do it between us. That was the compromise. Before I pass on to Nancy, there'll be time again to talk about it later, and I'm sure also afterwards. But if anyone else has one last question, then please feel free to raise it. Ed, good.
I thought a number of things, and one was just sort of, I felt this, like the tension throughout the whole film. You know, from the moment Alison walked in the door, there just seemed to be a palpable tension.
Yeah, the clock worked to our advantage that way. In terms of shooting, we just had one day, and it was filmed in the mother's house of a friend of mine. And partway through the shoot, his mother's neighbour decided to do some DIY, and the drill came out, and we thought, oh no, we've literally just got one day to shoot this. So we had a coffee break, and thankfully afterwards we could get back. But the clock we thought would be a good way really with the ticking to rack up the tension throughout. And we use fairly sort of classical Hollywood style techniques of introducing themes and showing things and then putting them all together. So at the end of the film, you don't really see anything you haven't been kind of prepared for, even though it's still a shock when you hear that sort of shrill scream before the figures are displayed.
The envelopes are very effective. She puts them down with such a precision, that's a tense precision. So I watch it and say, oh no. Could be arranging the socks in the drawer, but
Yeah, so many little ways.
Little things like that,
Yeah, even to just putting her feet on the coffee table,
Yes.
you know, something that would irritate this guy. And the thing that comes across often, and will be covered by something in Nancy's presentation, is that there's this thing of that no one knows how the guy's going to come home. Will he be in a good mood? Will he be in a bad mood? Often a manipulator can be the most charming person in the world, as we know. And one of the posters that shocked me was the sort of love-hate tattoos. You remember the guy has hate on his fist, but on the other hand, he has a bunch of flowers, and the tag is, which will it be tonight? So, anyway, we're sort of short of time, so I'll pass over.
there's a reason that survivors talk about feeling like they're walking on eggshells, and that film illustrates that really well. Before I launch into my slides, I just want to acknowledge that for some of you here, what you just saw reminds you of experiences you've had, or experiences that friends, loved ones have told you about. And this material is very difficult because, as you'll see from the data that I'll share and some that was in the film, this is something that affects people around us, whether we know that or not, whether they've disclosed that to us or not. So it's very difficult. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I want to start off by telling you two stories. One is about this little guy, 8 years old, whose name is Kyle, whom I met when I was working in Dallas, Texas. Kyle was at a shelter for battered women, and in the afternoons I would go pick up the children so that they could come and be participating in a day camp that I helped run. And at lunch one day I was sitting next to Kyle, and somehow we got talking about marriage. Now, marriage is not usually something I bring up with 8-year-old anythings, so I'm not quite sure how that happened, but we were talking about marriage. And I asked Kyle, "Do you think you'll ever get married?" And he paused for a long time, and he shook his head no. And I said, "Why not?" He said, "There's too much hitting in marriage." By the age of 8, Kyle had already learned that hitting was part of the package of marriage, and he didn't want to hit anybody, so he wasn't going to get married. Second story. For part of my life, I directed a women's center at the University of North Dakota, very rural. And we would go in with teams of people, and we would do programs that sororities and fraternities would jointly host. And one of the ones that we went in and did quite often was on acquaintance rape, dating violence. And during this program, we would survey the people who were there. And over the 3 or 4 years of my doing this program with colleagues to hundreds and hundreds of university students, 22% of the women answered yes to the question of whether they'd ever been forced towards sex to the point that they were kicking, crying, or screaming, which is a sexual assault. Now, if I asked them if they'd ever been sexually assaulted, they would have said no. But by describing the action, 22%. We would disclose the data to the students toward the end of the program, and they couldn't believe that it happened in a rural area like theirs. So the point of these two stories is that it does happen everywhere. There's no group that's immune. And it always impacts more than the person who's being hit directly, as Kyle's story shows. I want to take just a minute to talk about types of intimate partner violence. What I'm talking about tonight and what we look at in hagiography is intimate terrorism, the attempt by one partner to use some type of violence, could be emotional, psychological, sexual, physical, economic, and so forth, to completely control the other partner long term. And even without the partner of this woman in the film being in the household, you could see how effectively he was controlling her actions because of the threat of violence or the violence she'd already experienced. Now, this is what domestic violence, the kind of definition that a domestic violence advocate would use. This is different than violent resistance. That's usually defining a victim's response to intimate terrorism, which could result in death. You hear about a husband who's been abusive being shot as a woman tries to escape or that sort of thing. So that's in a victim's attempt to defend herself, which may result in violence against the perpetrator. But when I speak of, and then this third part, situational couples violence, that could be situationally provoked. It could be instigated by either partner. It could be an argument that extends into someone throwing something or hitting a wall or slapping the other partner. But this isn't systematic attempts to control the partner. This is something that usually does not result in any kind of injury. One person isn't chronically afraid of the other partner, so I want to differentiate between these kinds of violence. We're talking about intimate terrorism. So who are these terrorists? Lundy Bancroft is a person who has worked with batterer intervention groups for decades and now is on sort of a writing and speaking circuit, but he has this definition of batterers. A batterer is a person who exercises a pattern of coercive control in a partner relationship, punctuated by one or more acts of intimidating physical violence, sexual assault, or credible threat of physical violence. This pattern of control and intimidation may be predominantly psychological, economic, or sexual in nature, or may rely primarily on the use of physical violence. Intimate partner violence, and actually let me just say a word here. Some people prefer the use of domestic violence, especially I've heard that from people who have experienced sibling abuse, where they've been assaulted by a sibling, and they say when you use intimate partner violence, we disappear. Others feel like the phrase domestic violence somehow suggests a domestication of the violence, which isn't related to people's actual experience. So you'll hear me go back and forth in using these terms. So it's overwhelmingly a crime by men against women. Conflict may be instigated equally by men and women, as my situational violence definition showed, but violence rising to the level of criminal activity is overwhelmingly male. 85% of restraining orders are taken out on men, and one study by the National Institute of Justice found that 90% of systematic, persistent, and injurious violence is perpetrated by men. So I'm going to give you some data here just to kind of show the lay of the land. This is data for the United States. 1 in 5 women, about 20%, and 1 in 59 men have been raped in their lifetime. Nearly half of transgender people are raped at some point in their lifetimes. Now this, let me pause for a moment. This was a study that was published this past September, and it was based on a survey of over 12,000, almost 13,000 people done in 2011 throughout all 50 states and DC. So that's what this data is based on. So 22% of the women had been victims of severe physical violence by an intimate partner, while 1 in 7 of the men had. For men, most perpetrators are male. 1 in 6 women had been stalked in their lifetime, compared to 1 in 19 men. Female victims frequently experience multiple forms of intimate partner violence, physical assault, rape, stalking, and so forth. Male victims were most often experiencing physical violence alone. Nearly 60% of the male victims experienced intimate partner violence the first time when they were under the age of 25. For women, 71% experienced it for the first time when they were under the age of 25. For female rape victims, 99% of the perpetrators were male. 95% of sexual assaults other than rape were perpetrated by males. 79% of male victims had male perpetrators. 88% of women had male stalkers, but 48% of men who were stalked had male stalkers, so there were more female stalkers than male for the men who had been stalked. 85% of intimate partner violence victims are women, and 40 to 50% of murdered women in the United States are killed by a partner or spouse. And regardless of which partner is killed, 70 to 80% of homicides in the U.S. are preceded by male-on-female battering. That's where I'm talking about the self-defense that some survivors have to use to be able to get out. In the United States, intimate partner violence is the leading reason that women visit emergency rooms for injuries. Battering is a factor in 1/4 of female suicide attempts and the #1 cause of substance abuse in women. 30% of women who have lived with a man report experiencing some level of violence. Intimate partner violence occurs in 40 to 50%, about 40% of gay and bisexual male relationships, about 10 to 15% of lesbian relationships, although some data puts that number higher. And you'll see in these, this last point about transgender individuals that many of them are sexually assaulted while in police custody or in jail. 15% reported that experience. It doubles when you're talking about African American or black transgender people. And they also tend to be assaulted by police officers and healthcare professionals. When you break this down by race and ethnicity, and you think about violence that includes sexual assault, physical violence, and stalking, you can see that about 24% of Latinas, about 32% of black non-Hispanic, 28% of white, 42% of American Indian, Alaskan Native, and 43% of multiracial women report this violence in their lifetimes. The numbers are even higher if you include psychological abuse of these women. For men, about 11% of Latinos, almost 17% of black, about 11% of white, and 22.5% of multiracial men report this violence over the course of a lifetime. So one question that always comes up is, why do people stay? And I'm going to show you a little clip that Beverly Gooden created in the wake of the Ray Rice video that went viral, where she tries to answer this question. Pretty powerful. You think about how widespread this is. Consider that in 6 years of the Iraq War, the U.S. had just over 4,000 deaths and about 32,000 casualties. During that same period, if we look at the casualties related to intimate partner violence, there were 9,000 murders, 75% of which were women, and almost 29 million intimate partner violence assaults and rapes of women. Those numbers are higher when men are included. This is a situation that is of epidemic proportion, so it's not something we can't not do something about.
It's interesting. I think whenever we do this, we have the most silent audiences until the end, because it's also shocking and overwhelming. But I want to address the question of what's the value of studying historical narratives of violence. That's a question I asked myself when I first started. Am I doing this as an historian? Is this going to help anybody? And so through the programs that Nancy and I presented, we had so many people say, yes, you know, I grew up on some of these stories and saints, and yeah, please take them apart, show them for what they are. So what do historical narratives tell us? For one, they answer the question, have things always been this bad? Can you hear me okay? Is that good? Okay. Some might say that if this problem began in the 20th century, it might just go away in the 21st. You know, people like that who just want to ignore problems. Just as some people think that climate change will go away, while they refuse to treat the underlying mistreatment of the environment. It will just, you know, it's part of a cycle, it will end, that sort of thing. But narratives, historical ones, tell us that intimate partner violence has deep roots in history. Historical narratives offer perspectives on the contemporary problem, uncovering attitudes that excuse battering and recovering the history of those attitudes sharpens our understanding of violence against women in the present. You might recognize in a historical story something that's happening down the street from you, and you see it away from a person you know, and it hits you. Historical scholarship provides a context for contemporary efforts at social change. It strengthens the call to provide needed responses. Challenging and interrogating historical text sharpens the ability to perceive and challenge contemporary situations of violence. It gives us more acute perception and ways of approaching the situation, just as we would approach an historical text. The complexities of narrative have been studied for a long time by scholars in the humanities. Analyzing and understanding how people tell stories has proven valuable for counselors, therapists, ministers. Attentiveness to the stories of patients has been recommended for physicians who need to evaluate what their patients tell them and decide whether the patient is in danger or not. We found a book about analyzing narrative that was aimed at an audience of physicians with this kind of a literary study of techniques to help them see what gaps in the story might mean other than nothing. Sometimes the gap is the absolute worst part that the person cannot utter. But the narratives I'll mention today range from the 4th to the 19th century. We include plenty from the, what have we got left? The 20th and the 21st, but today I'll stop with the 19th. Rarely before the 18th century do we find a woman telling her own story. So we most often end up analyzing the attitude of the male narrator or speaker, which reflects the surrounding religious culture. I'll mention several women whose stories have been instructive. The first is the mother of Augustine of Hippo, Monica. She counseled her friends to remain silent, subservient, and obedient in order to avoid their husband's blows. Interpretation of the scriptural text, 1 Peter 3, 1-6, defines Monica and subsequent Christian wives. Self-sacrifice and obedience are characteristic of Christian virtue in women and may be used by God to elicit the conversion of others. As Augustine describes his mother Monica, she is simultaneously a mother, a child, and a servant, obedient above all. Is that okay? Next we will mention Radegund, who's a 6th century woman. She was kidnapped at the age of 6 and was forced to marry Clothar I, king of the Franks. After the king had her brother murdered, she entered a convent and became a deaconess with the help of churchmen who were powerful enough to oppose her ruthless husband. In the slide there, I hope you can see Clothar sort of reaching out for her on the right side of the picture. She's in the center, and at the bottom center, she stretched herself out on a cold stone floor to punish herself, hoping that that will make things go away. So since she was a queen, at a time when the church wasn't organized, she could get powerful bishops, abbots to help her out. As the church became more centralized, that became more difficult and impossible. Next, we have Godlieve of Gistel in the 11th century. She was forced by her family into a political marriage. She escaped once from her husband's home, but was sent back under orders of the local count and bishop. The husband swiftly hired henchmen to execute her. So this is the story I found in 1991, and it sounded exactly what I had just seen in the newspaper. And then, as we've heard from Nancy and Robert, the time that a woman is most susceptible to being killed is when she tries to leave. And that's what happened to Godlieve. I think, do we have the altarpiece up there?
I do.
Yeah, there's a 7-part altarpiece that is a narrative. It begins on the left with Godlieve preparing to leave her father's house and moves over to the right, almost far right, to the shocking scene that's on her poster where the husband's henchmen are strangling her with a cloth. They didn't want marks left on her neck, so they used a cloth, and then they dumped her in a well to try to white out the red marks. So that's the way she's mostly remembered, is with like that. And so imagine this as an altarpiece. And then we have another, we have another slide there, which comes from a later period, and there's Godlieve, I think, in black and white, and then the wife of the person who commissioned the painting there in her finery. And in the back, just above the prayer desk and above Godlieve, I believe, is another version of the scene of her murder. So it's the woman is praying and bringing that to mind. I don't think I want to imagine what she's praying, but it's maybe part of the literature of being an obedient wife. I don't know. This is a 16th century painting, I think, but the date is up there. After she was murdered, she was revered by local people because miracles were reported at her grave. And they remember her in a festival and a drama every year. But the church was not pleased with local people claiming a saint, and so they sent in a trusty monk to write up the story and make sure that the church was in control of her sanctity. And that's the text that we have. The earliest version that we have shows the husband just kind of disappearing from the story and suffering no consequences. It was rewritten later in another attempt, I think, to sort of clean up the story, and then the husband converts. So that goes back to the biblical passage from 1 Peter about bringing about, the woman's suffering will bring about the conversion of the husband. Dorothy of Montaut is one of several women I'll mention quickly. She was Prussia's first native saint. She underwent years of beatings from her husband, according to her hagiography, but modeled her obedience on the example of Christ. After one severe beating, we find an intervention on the part of her confessors who reproach the husband for his excessive cruelty. Beating was okay, excessive cruelty was not. Several Italian saints' lives from the 13th through the 15th century refer to a woman suffering at the hands of a spouse. The abuse in those accounts is imprecise. It might say that she suffered insults or injuries, or it doesn't have a lot of detail, or it leaves it murky whether it's the husband's family or the husband. Several of examples of stories like that are Umiliana de Cerchi from Florence, Angela of Foligno, Rita of Cascia, who was the patron of abused wives and hopeless causes, Maria Sturian of Venice, who was abandoned by her husband, Catherine of Genoa, who was a member of one of Italy's most prominent families. She was pressured into a political marriage, spent 5 years nearly isolated while her husband mistreated her, gambled, and pursued other women. Why does abuse figure in these saints' lives and other saints' lives? This is just a sample. For one, it reflects social reality. We can assume fairly safely that that's what medieval households were like. It certainly does belong in the storytelling toolbox of the medieval narrator or hagiographer. Why is that? Because it accentuates suffering, and women, male heroes in hagiography suffer, but in a very, very different way. Females are supposed to suffer by all sorts of means, and what better one than a husband? It also serves to minimize sexual relations. The holy woman has a good reason to avoid her husband. She's not being a bad wife, it's not safe to get near him, and she even lives away from him sometimes. One of my students discovered a startling rewriting of the life of Elizabeth of Hungary in a 14th century Italian manuscript that belongs to Harvard Houghton Library. Early versions of Elizabeth's life describe her husband working with her to care for the poor. Then we find a sort of middle stage where they cast Elizabeth as fearful of her husband's reaction to her donations of his goods. But he's not violent. And I thank Allison Moore, who's an expert on Elizabeth, for letting me know about the first versions where they work together. Surprisingly, this Italian manuscript, which is a manuscript of saints' lives, a Franciscan manuscript, changes the story and makes the husband into an abuser. My student was just amazed when she found that. Why would this happen? My best guess is that it seems to indicate that abuse by a spouse was becoming as common in hagiography as it was in medieval households. Makes violence seem normal for a marriage, like Kyle says. Sermons and marriage manuals supplement saints' lives by looking into household situations. So we find sermons that friars, that is Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians preached, and also manuals that they wrote up for marriage. That's especially after the 15th century. Remember, the 14th century was a plague. and people were coming back to life in the 15th century, and married couples were urged to procreate and have proper marriages for children to grow up and to repopulate society. The 15th century friar Bernardino of Siena actually advised men never to beat their wives, especially if they were pregnant. However, Bernardino's sermons indicate that husbands beat their wives for a number of reasons. So he'll say, don't do this, but then tell stories about it. One of them that might surprise us is a wife who did not dress with sufficient elegance could be beaten. This is 15th century Italy, where elegance is the norm, and men competed with other men by dressing up their wives. So, a later friar, Cherubino of Spoleto, composed a rule for married life. He advises, and he was even quoted in the Kootenai County, Idaho newspaper when they were doing it, so he gets all around. He says, unforgettably, beat her, not out of anger, but with a zeal and charity for her soul, so that the beating will be fruitful and meritorious. If that doesn't work, give her bitter treatment. And many other things like that, I could go on for a while on Cherubino. What could battered women do? They had really no recourse. Occasionally, a confessor might intervene, like Dorothy of Montaus, but generally there was nothing. So we find stories of women who searched for remedies on the margin of societies, that is, potions or wax figures. And a woman named Mateuccia of Todi is in central Italy in Umbria, prepared herbal drinks and wax images, especially for battered women, and they would use them while reciting incantations or prayers. Mateuccia, however, was not appreciated by the church or civil society. In 1428, she was one of the first people to be executed as a sorceress. And this is the notice of the execution, that's the record of it, and notice that they depict her with wild hair. I guess if you're a sorceress, that's what you're supposed to have. Unfortunately, I can't play the role. Stories of courageous women who endure violence continue far beyond the Middle Ages, as do marriage manuals, sermons, and other advice literature. Frances Dolan did a study of marriage in early modern England. She includes a poster of Henry VIII that was used for one of the first domestic violence awareness months, and it has the warning, it's not worth being his queen one day if you're his victim the next. Dolan examines several 17th century writers who composed works on marriage. I'm just going to cite one of them. George Gough, a preacher in London, advises women, and I'll quote from George in his English, howsoever their husbands may deal roughly and untowardly with them, yet God will graciously respect them, if they shall patiently, in obedience to his ordinance, bear their husbands' unjust reproofs. So Frances Dolan cites more pages of things just like that. Some evidence for punishing batterers finally surfaces in Europe. Some Calvinist cities disciplined men for wife beating, and that led some folks to call 16th century Geneva a women's paradise. Now, we know that there's a lot more to go with that, but that's just doing one little thing would get the city called a women's paradise. In the colonies, the courts generally followed British common law. The Puritans right here in Massachusetts attempted to make a step forward with the 1641 Body of Liberties by forbidding wife beating. It's defined as bodily correction or lashing of a wife except in self-defense. So that was big progress. Didn't become official, of course, because the king squashed it quickly, but it was there. However, for the Puritans, in this document, physical abuse was not grounds for divorce. So it wasn't supposed to happen, but what would you do if it did? Furthermore, missionaries brought the concept and practice of subordinating women into the New World and incorporated it into the sort of Christian social structure that they attempted to impose on native peoples. And you can ask Nancy about that later for some examples. Rare are such men as the 18th century colonists in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Is that where the big bridge is off the New Jersey Turnpike? Elizabethtown? Or maybe that's Elizabeth. But anyway, if you go by, remember these guys. They called themselves regulars, and they made nighttime raids on wife beaters and flogged them. So that's yay for the regulars, right? Around the same time in New Hampshire, Abigail Abbott Bailey recorded in her diary the abuse she endured during 25 years of marriage. So we have an account by Abigail. However, if we read the introduction carefully, we find that the manuscript that was used was edited by a man. So we don't really know. We don't have the whole thing just by Abigail as far as I know, but we're getting closer anyway. She struggled to understand her suffering in terms of God's will, and she wrote, "I now begin to learn with trembling that it was the sovereign pleasure of the all-wise God to try me with afflictions in that relation from which I had hoped to receive the greatest of my earthly comforts." That's just, yeah, what a statement. She finally fled under the harshest of circumstances, the middle of winter in New Hampshire, and achieved a divorce in 1793, so good for New Hampshire. One historian of law describes changes made in 19th century America to laws of male family control as Lilliputian. Remember the tiny little people and Jonathan Swift. A 19th century Italian woman, Elizabeth Canori, who was a near contemporary of Abigail's, was praised for her, quote, absolute fidelity in the face of physical and psychological violence, unquote, from her husband. After Elizabeth's death, her husband became a priest, and Elizabeth was canonized in 1994. So 1994, she's being praised just about the same way Godly was and other people before her. I close with a remarkable story from an Inquisition register with testimonies from the 14th century southern French Pyrenees. Historian Anne Brenon reconstructed the life of a young woman named Guillaume Maury, who at the age of 18 left the village of Montaillou, the famous Montaillou of social history, and her parents' home to marry a barrel maker. That was a pretty good living in the village of Montaillou. She wasn't there. It was half a day away. The village of Montaillou remembered Guillaume in a play in 2007, and the people you see in a scene looking down was the actual village. And we got up the hill. I couldn't do it now, but I got most of the way up then so we could take pictures. Guillaume and her family lived out the beliefs of the dissident Christians who were commonly called Cathars. However, they called themselves good men and good women. Shortly after Guillaume's marriage in June of 1306, her brother, Père, which is like Pierre, left the sheep he tended in the mountains and went to buy rams in a nearby town, or in the village actually, where his newly married sister lived. While spending the night at the brother-in-law's home, he heard the brother-in-law beating his sister. The next day, he ran into some old friends of his. One was a Cathar perfect, which is the equivalent of a pastor. Again, perfect is a name that's given by inquisitors and not by the Cathars themselves, who was in hiding. Pierre discussed his sister's marriage with the friends. One of the friends had seen Guillaume not long before at her father's house in Montaigu. She had just fled from her husband for the first time. She told me then, he said, that if I did not take her to a place where she could serve the good Christians, the Cathars, she herself would start to wander through the world because, dead or alive, she refused to stay with her husband. So that's like the tweets you have. The Cathar pastor recommended that Guillaume should be placed in the home of a Cathar believer where she could serve the community. He preached from Matthew 12 on the duty to assist a soul in danger. And he instructed Pierre, the brother of Guillaume, as follows: "Your sister is in the hands of an evil man. That is why you will have a great reward if you help her to leave him. I order you on behalf of the church," that is the Cathar Church, "and I absolve you on behalf of God from any sin that could happen to you from doing this." So we wish we found more of that. A few days later, at nightfall, brother and sister met at the cross in the cemetery. In 4 days, they arrived at a town where Guillaume lived, in a small community house of the last Cathar church. Sometime later, Guillaume disguised herself as a man in order to journey secretly through the mountains. She was a victim, however, of the 1309 inquisitorial raid that closed in on the clandestine church in those areas. She and her family were condemned to prison. Their house in Montaigu was destroyed and all the family's belongings were confiscated. Guillaume probably died with family members of starvation and exhaustion in the inquisitorial prison. Her religion allowed her escape from a violent husband, but she died as a victim of persecution by the church she opposed. A French playwright composed a play that tells Guillaume's story. That's what you've seen in the slides. Residents of Montaigu and the surrounding area participated in the drama. The inhabitants of Todi, the town of Montaigu, also have remembered her in their town's medieval festival. And in Gistel, there is an annual commemoration in the remembrance of Godlief's story with a drama and a procession through the town. One of my students who has been working here, Jane Anna Chapman, read this story years ago and then went to Gistel to see what was going on and collected postcards for me. Clearly, all these townspeople, albeit in very different mindsets, remember the women of the Middle Ages who died in their midst, murdered, executed, rescued, but then left to die in prison. Will we remember them and the women who die every day at the hands of an abusive partner? I hope so, and I hope that our remembrance leads to action. Thank you.
So there's a little bit more that I'd hope to share with you. We're at the end of our time, but I'm gonna take about 5-10 minutes. If you need to leave, leave, and if you can hang around a little bit after that and talk with us, that would be great. But let me just try to briefly go through this this piece that I have. So I want to talk about the role of religious beliefs. We want to think that in our mosques or synagogues or churches or other houses of worship, this kind of thing doesn't occur. But it's alive and well. There's no area that's immune. And in fact, many of us are still raised in religious homes. And so when intimate partner violence occurs, we often turn to faith in a crisis. We may we may think that that's the only resource that we have. When people are battered, they bring their religious background and teaching into that incident with them, and the batterer does that too. So the crisis is physical and emotional, but also often spiritual. And this is the case whether people are adults or children. I've had one student of mine tell me years ago that when she was a child, she heard in the Sunday school that God watches over those God loves. And at the time, she was being sexually assaulted by 2 boys in her neighborhood. So she figured God must not love her because God wasn't watching over her. So these, we turn to faith, we think about our faith regardless of age when these kinds of incidents happen to us. Now, women often get life-threatening advice from clergy. Things like submit to your husband, try to get the person to church, pray harder, lift the abuse up to God, forgive the abuser, and take him back. And these responses blame the woman and make changing the violence her responsibility, or they require forgiveness of the abuse without any justice. Many men who are victims also get bad advice. They may be told that they're responsible for their family and they can't leave. Buck up, be a man, reassert that sense of being head of household, or get a reminder that since Christ sacrificed himself for the church, marriage is a place where the husband does that for the wife. Or treat your partner with dignity and respect, and that person will come around. Leaders in faith traditions can be critical resources for survivors because their theological responses to abuse are often an important factor to a victim's willingness to leave and thus to their ability to survive. In fact, survivors often feel they must choose between their beliefs and their physical safety, that they can't have both. When you have religious leaders who are roadblocks, they reinforce that belief. Religious leaders who are resources set women and men free to leave abusive relationships. There was a woman that Beverly and I had in a class several years ago who told us about her repeated attempts to go to her parish priest to seek support for the abuse that she was experiencing from her husband. And each time the priest sent her back and told her to try something else to try to get him to stop being violent, which of course can't work because he's the only one that can stop being violent. She can't control him. Finally, a new priest came into the area and she went to him, and I don't know how she got the courage to do so, but she tried once again to go to a priest and talk about this. And that priest listened to her story, and then when she finished, he turned to her and said, the first time that he harmed you, he broke the marriage covenant and you were no longer bound by it. And she turned to us in the classroom and she said it was like he opened my prison door and I walked through. There wasn't another person that could have told her what she needed to hear to feel that it was okay to leave that relationship. That's the power that religious leaders have. This research you have on this slide before you shows that even minimal social support can make a difference to survivors. And of course, houses of worship, religious bodies, often are a place where people find great social support. So women who don't have social support seek help less, remain for longer periods of time in abusive relationships, and experience more abuse and more severe abuse. When religious leaders are helpful, their role is critical. I'll just show you 2 studies here. Women who are in abusive relationships, if clergy are compassionate in listening to them, counseling them, even if they don't have a lot of experience with the topic, if they're just compassionate and believe them, there are measurable outcomes, psychological outcomes for these women. And when clergy ask batterers to attend intervention programs, they are more likely to go to those programs and finish them than when they're mandated by courts. And when both the court and clergy mandate or request that abusers go, they're that much more likely to end. So clergy actually have more power in holding batterers accountable than a court does. So they can be just critical in disrupting and preventing intimate partner violence. Just real briefly, when Beverly and I have compared the hagiography with contemporary narratives, we found that there are 3 themes that seem to recur. One is this theology of suffering and patience, one is a theology of subordination and obedience, and one is a theology of ownership and power. Now, a theology of suffering and patience is recommends suffering as a way to imitate Christ, and you saw that in some of the stories of saints that Beverly shared with us. And for some battered women that I've interviewed, this suffering is one of the things that they're told by clergy they turn to for help. Scripture can reinforce this suffering, as the 1 Peter passage that Beverly referred to indicates. And we need to really rethink a theology of suffering so that we don't end it with the cross. If the whole idea of Christ and the crucifixion ends with Christ on the cross, then yes, to imitate Christ, you stay on your cross. But that's not where it ended. It ended with the resurrection. And if we look at the resurrection as the way to imitate Christ, an end to suffering, a creation of justice, then when we recommend being Christ-like to survivors, we're telling them that they have a responsibility to end the suffering in their lives and to seek justice. With the theology of obedience and subordination, this arises from understandings that there's a God-ordained natural order for relationships, with God first, men second, women and children third. And this theology functions in harmony with social forces of subordination. It's often reinforced by literal interpretations of passages like Ephesians 5:22, wives, be subject to your husband. And they find in research that clergy who believe this theology of obedience also believe that God will give victims the power to survive, which of course allows the perpetrators to go unchallenged. In one study, although 83% of the clergy said that the victim should separate from the husband because of the violence, 93% of those same clergy recommended couples counseling. Extremely dangerous. If a survivor actually talks about what's going on at home in couples counseling, she'll pay for it when she does get home. You can't have couples counseling in a situation where there's violence in the relationship. With the theology of ownership and power, we see this rooted in the early belief that women are inferior and have an inferior moral nature to that of men. We see that there's a lot of fear that if women's nature goes unchecked, the whole world will go into chaos. You see these themes repeatedly in church fathers. One of my favorites comes from Tertullian, who said that women were the devil's gateway. That puts it pretty clear. Augustine talks about this. Calvin and Luther also recommended that battered women stay in abusive relationships when they came to them for help. Calvin said that God will give her patience, and she should not deviate from the duty which she has before God to please her husband, but to be faithful whatever happens. Again, Scripture reinforces these kinds of mandates. Christine Goodar found that the Bible repeatedly orders women to submit to husbands and treats the giving and taking of women, the rapes and killing, as matters of male prerogative. These are the kinds of messages that we must interrupt and that can do great harm to a survivor who feels she or he has to choose between faith and safety, that they can't have both. So where do we go? We need to turn these roadblocks into resources by refocusing on the understanding that we are all created in the image of God and equal in God's eyes. We need to work for gender equality in society because ideas about gender impact clergy beliefs about intimate partner violence. In one study, they found that adherence to fundamentalist religious beliefs and the gender of the clergy indicated whether or not the minister would ask women about spouse abuse and the degree to which a wife or husband would be judged responsible for the abuse. The more fundamentalist the beliefs, the more likely it was that the wife would be judged responsible for the abuse. And many of you might have seen that UN report that was published in the New York Times this morning about abuse globally that we mentioned at the beginning. There, too, they found that in those countries with very conservative beliefs about male and female roles, there was much less intervention in intimate partner violence. We have a lot of work to do, And unless we can disrupt these messages, we're not going to be able to turn the tide on intimate partner violence. It will always be the case that we turn to those things that are important grounders in our lives, and faith often is that grounder in survivors' lives. Unless we can change the messages they receive, somebody 2,000 years from now is going to be doing research and comparing narratives in hagiography and in the 21st century and their own century and find that nothing has changed. Thank you very much.
What shall we do?
So I think what we should do, since we're a little after our time, is let you go, get some coffee or water if you want to. We'll hang around for a while. If you want to stay and ask some questions, we'll do that, but we want to honor the time commitment that we gave you for the session. How does that sound? So let's just take a minute, stretch, leave if you need to, but we'll sit up here and be ready to answer questions for those of you who need to stay.
We could just.
Do you have any books that you recommend? Because you were talking about like survivor support networks.
Yep.
For example, and I'm thinking about situations where, like, for me, I'm very external to like religious communities. I'm in a entire parenting network that's very much located within those. So I'm wondering if you have any books that fit within different sort of religious communities. For me, it would be like evangelical Christian and non-denominational Protestant Christian networks that that may be resources that I could give as like within that support network, because I don't really count when it comes to that support network.
You know, what I would do is I would look at, I would go on the website of the Faith Trust Institute, which is an organization that Marie Fortune started, and there are all kinds of resources for Christians. She's got a little booklet called Women Keeping Faith, and it's just a little tiny paperback piece, but it's basically answering questions that Christian women have about whether or not it's okay to leave a violent relationship, and she's going right into Scripture, and so she's using the same tool, the Bible, to give them opposite message about why it's not only appropriate, but that God doesn't want you to suffer abuse. So, and I'll give you my card afterwards, and you can email me, and I'll send you a list of other resources. Okay? Sure. Yeah.
Beverly, I wanted to ask you a little bit of follow-up on the saints narratives. I thought that was fascinating. And I'm wondering, do you see similar patterns, or have you explored any of the patterns that's in Eastern Orthodox family churches?
Well, I started looking into that. I think it was either 1999 or 2000. No, somewhere in the late 90s. Nancy and I were teaching together. And at that time, we had someone who was Orthodox on the faculty. I invited him to give a lecture and talk about it. And what he pointed to mostly were stories about the violence that's ingrained in the early martyr stories. And he didn't, remember, give us examples of later things.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
I don't think that, because we wondered if we were missing something major. And then we looked at, so we could get those in translation, and then the Syrian martyrs in translation. And they are even more gruesome than the Christian martyr stories as far as what's done to the people and to the women. But I honestly don't, there was nothing that we felt compelled to put in, so there didn't seem to be that, but it's possible that since then someone has found them, and they have to be found, edited, and all of that, and maybe they wouldn't have been, whereas in the West they were. So I wouldn't want to say that I have the final word on it.
Sure.
Thank you for that talk. It was very enlightening. My question is regarding the batterer's psychological state of mind. I wonder if a lot of studies have been done just to see what is the
So there certainly, when you grow up in an abusive household, for boys who grow up in an abusive household, they are more likely to repeat the abuse. It's not a one-to-one ratio, certainly, but they're more likely than boys who don't witness that, although there are many abusers who grew up in households where there wasn't any violence present and became violent in relationships. And for women, for girls, the research that I've seen seems to indicate that it's not more likely that they'll be in an abusive relationship, but they'll stay longer if they witnessed it at home. So they'll more or less see this as maybe the norm, you know, sort of along the lines of Kyle thinking hitting was part of marriage, you know. Psychologically, abusers test out normal. Yes, that's one of the shocking things. But when you think about what's the logical, radical conclusion of being in a patriarchal culture? Absolute male control of women. So they do tend to have be quite narcissistic, where the entire world revolves around them and their needs trump everything else, including the children's needs. In fact, they will get quite angry if anything, including a crying baby, is disrupting them, and often refuse to let the spouse or partner go and see to the child. But you know, there's a small percentage, it's less than 10%, that have psychological problems that are really a reason behind the violence, or at least a very important factor behind the violence. And this, Dr. David Adams, who works at Emerge, which is a batterer intervention program here in Cambridge for men, this is based on thousands of clients he's seen over decades of doing this, and he himself has a doctorate in psychology. So, and you know, this is one of the difficult things. When batterers go back into a community, they usually get worse because unfortunately, too often the men in their world, they don't interrupt the sense of entitlement, male entitlement, that is a very important piece of who batterers are. In fact, if you want to predict whether or not a youth, adolescent boy will become a batterer, when he's maybe 12 or 13, if he has a real sense of entitlement in relation to women, that's a very high risk factor that he will himself become a batterer. If he hasn't adopted that attitude from men around him or a batterer in his household, he's far less likely to become a batterer when he becomes an adult.
Just following up on that question, I know Robert mentioned experience of working with some violent offenders in prisons. And I was wondering if there was the trivialization that you mentioned, or the normalization as part of their accepted narrative, or if they were as normal as the Nancy just explained to us.
Well, certainly the men I worked with came from a spectrum of backgrounds, and there would be some commonality. Certainly many abusers, violent abusers, had themselves been abused and witnessed abuse at home and in surrounding areas. Many of the violent men inside had not just been brought up in a violent atmosphere at home, but had actively thought one out as well. Many had educational issues and found violence as a way of getting respect from peers, and also, for some, sadly, a means of making money. I was part of a radio program that looked at conversion from a prisoner's point of view, although I never met the prisoner, so I'm not betraying any confidences that were shared in a restricted forum. And the guy spoke about how, when he was inside, he came to think about the wife and the children he had left at home by being a thug for a gang. And he thought that was wrong, and he kept a budgeriguard in his cell, which he came to love. And because of his love for the budgerigard, he thought he should really rethink the love he had for his family. And his story took off. It attracted a lot of interest, and people often overlook the obvious point, well, is this not just another story that he's telling to manipulate? That was my sort of take on it, and the guy is back in prison. So coming back to Nancy's point, there is a certain egocentricism of abusers who find through their abuse a way of getting respect and power, and that would be a common sort of element that I found in the prisoners convicted of violent crimes.
Let me just add one other piece, that it's experiencing violence at home for boys is a better predictor of their getting into fights with other kids than it is that they'll be, I mean, there is certainly a risk that they will be violent in relationships, but there's even a greater risk that they will end up fighting in general fights with children around them in neighborhoods. And, you know, certainly when you know who's in prison and what their backgrounds are, you see a lot of violence in those backgrounds. Anything else?
I think just that it's so, the stats are so scary for the Western world. What in heaven's name can we do to help the third world? I mean, it just scares you when women are commodities, and it's just horrible to think about.
And we don't have the best record of stats. We're not. We certainly aren't the leader in terms of the low incidence of intimate partner violence. We have. So there are countries that are worse than the U.S., but there are many countries that are better than the U.S. too. So, yeah, if there's not nearly as much research done on men who are abusive as there are on survivors, and we need a lot more research. There could be things that we just haven't learned yet that could help us in treatment of survivors, so they're much less likely to offend. I mean, at this point, even in the best intervention programs, like this program in Emerge, which is the oldest in the country, and I think the best in the country, it's still, batterers usually have to go through it a couple of times if they're really going to change their behavior. There's so much cultural support for male violence, and this sort of goes back to your research, Robert, for men being in the world in a particular way, and so much enforcement of that for men who try to choose a different path, that unless we can figure that out, or if we could figure that out and let boys grow up to be whatever they are, let children grow up to be whatever they are, instead of slotting them into these roles, which usually don't fit any of us very well. If we could figure that out, then we could maybe spread the gospel to other countries, but we need to figure that out and do a lot more research on that.
Sure, if I could just add one tiny little point to that and it would be, what happens next when someone leaves? What happens when someone leaves an abusive relationship? How will they help through that? That's a big question. But also, what happens to the violent abuser who wakes up and has an epiphany? What comes next? When prisoners are released, often they fall back into a life of crime because who's going to hire them to do a regular job? No one.
Yeah, that's why one of the things we talk about in the war zone class is the fact that if a couple in your church, say, are experiencing violence, you aren't just the pastor to the survivor. You are also the pastor to the abuser. And one of the things that religious communities can do to help the survivor and the abuser is to hold that survivor accountable. Because if the survivor reoffends, he's back in jail again, and that doesn't do him or anyone else in his life any favors. But learning how to do that is tricky because abusers are very good at manipulating their surroundings toward their own ends. So you can't do that without a lot of education and maybe some consults, so that you don't get pulled into the abuser's way of seeing the world and thus just contribute to further abuse. It's very, very difficult. There's a guy named David Livingstone who has written a book suggesting a way that survivors could be reintroduced into congregations. And it's a bold move on his part, But when you read that book and all the steps that he thinks a congregation would have to take to really be able to do this in a way that's safe for the survivor and children, if there are children, most congregations can barely get volunteers for coffee hour, let alone manage something like this. So, you know, I'm not an optimist when it comes to these things. But both parties have to be supported. We have to support abusers into change.
Any further questions? No? Well, I want to thank Nancy and Robert very much for coming today to participate in the panel, and I'll thank Kristen again back there for putting everything together and also bringing us some nice lovely flowers to brighten our
dismal topic.
Yeah, I was trying to find the word, yeah. And thank you for patiently waiting with us, and also our IT person. Jennifer, yes. Thank you for waiting, and thank you all for coming.
Yeah, have a good night.